extreme suspicion of corporations, and chartering corporations was something the government did at its own whim, and they could rescind those charters without even a reason. And then I think during the progressive period of Teddy Roosevelt, corporations got a bad rap for being too big, too powerful. Now it seems we're on the other side, that, there's an admiration that goes with companies the size of Bechtel, and almost an admiration for the secrecy. That if you don't have to report, wow, you're really powerful.
I think it's an enviable position that its rivals, I think, truly do envy. One of the things that really struck me when I started out, I kept thinking, because of the symbiotic relationship between Bechtel and the U.S. government and American foreign policy through several decades. When I started, I thought, well, here's Bechtel, who's kind of, the corporate arm of the U.S. government. And by the end of my research and writing, I felt like oftentimes U.S. government was the public policy arm of Bechtel. That in many ways, Bechtel was larger than the U.S. government.
Sally Denton is the author of The Profiteers, Bechtel, and the Men Who Built the World. Thanks so much, Sally.
Thank you.
And here's something to take with you today. Since we were talking about famous government construction work, the Parthenon was built under the supervision of the Uber contractor and sculptor Phidias. Phidias acted as supervisor of all architectural and artistic works for the Acropolis in Athens. All of the exterior sculpture was produced under his direction, but Phidias's personal contributions have been effaced, including his...
All a big deal in a country that once banned rock and roll. The concert marks the end of a historic week for U.S.-Cuba relations. Tim Paget covers Latin America for
We can't hear you at all.
A public radio station in Miami. Did you turn down your thing?
Oh. Never mind. I had turned down.
Emina's like, I've been talking. Oh, okay. Several hours from now, the Rolling Stones will take the stage in Havana, Cuba. It will be the biggest rock show the country's seen since communists took over in 1959. More than a half million people are expected to attend, and it'll be projected on 10 jumbo screens. All a big deal in a country that once banned rock and roll. The concert marks the end of a historic week for U.S.-Cuba relations. Tim Paget covers Latin America for WLRN, a public radio station in Miami. He just got back from Cuba, and I asked him what he saw.
New York City public advocate Letitia James is suing the city's Department of Education to force it to improve services for the more than 100,000 special needs students in its schools.
Thank you, Boo. I don't even know why this is on here. It's confusing. You good? Relax. You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's March 25th. I'm Jeffy Bernard.
And I'm Shandukani Muraudzi. Nearly 2 years after a surge in unaccompanied child migrants to the U.S., courts are still backlogged.
We can't take all of these cases there are still children that still have to continue appearing in immigration court with no one beside them.
A new gene editing technology is available, but a fight over ethics is dividing the scientific community.
I think it would be irresponsible of the human race to not allow people to have access to these technologies.
New York City is increasingly banning hoverboards. They can be fun, but also cause fires and falls.
It went from, oh wow, look, Emily's doing the hoverboard, to she is seriously injured and we need to get her medical attention immediately.
All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lori London. Defense officials say U.S. military operations this week have taken out a number of Islamic State leaders, including the finance minister of the group, also known as ISIL.
We are systematically eliminating ISIL's cabinet. Indeed, the U.S. military killed several key ISIL terrorists this week, including, we believe, Haji Iman, who was an ISIL leader, senior leader, serving as a finance minister, and who also is responsible for some external affairs and plots.
In making the announcement today, Defense Secretary Ash Carter says Haji Iman was a well-known terrorist who unquestionably was a major part of ISIS efforts to recruit foreign fighters. Carter says while this will hinder the terror network's operations, he understands the group quickly replaces leaders that have been killed. As the investigation into Tuesday's bombings in Brussels continues, NPR's Eleanor Beardsley reports that 3 men have been detained following more police raids.
The 3 men being held were arrested in raids across the city last night. 3 other people were let go. Today, police apprehended a man and shot him in the leg before exploding his suitcase. Residents in the Schaerbeek neighborhood of Brussels were told to stay inside and away from windows. It's the same neighborhood where brother suicide bombers Ibrahim and Khalid Boukraoui were staying. Police are looking for accomplices in Tuesday's train and airport attacks that killed 31 people. Eleanor Beardsley, NPR News, Brussels.
The Nigerian military claims to have rescued hundreds of hostages of the Islamist militant group Boko Haram. NPR's Gregory Warner reports it's not immediately clear whether the rescues included any of the schoolgirls kidnapped nearly 2 years ago that sparked the Bring Back Our Girls movement.
The 800 hostages were all rescued in the northeastern Nigerian state of Borno. It's the same state where 2 years ago more than 200 schoolgirls were kidnapped from the village of Chibok by the Islamist group. The global outcry over that kidnapping led to a regional military coalition that has turned the tables of the war, routing many Boko Haram holdouts and freeing many hostages. But Boko Haram continues to launch deadly attacks. 2 female suicide bombers sent by the group were intercepted in Cameroon. One blew herself up, but the other surrendered, claiming that she is one of the kidnapped Chibok girls, and she's 15 years old. Gregory Warner, NPR News, Nairobi.
Facebook and Apple join a growing list of companies not happy with a controversial new law in North Carolina that overturned anti-discrimination protections for the LGBT community. Others condemning the law include Microsoft, PayPal, Wells Fargo, and American Airlines. The U.S. financial markets are closed today in observance of Good Friday. This is NPR News.
In New York, I'm Henriette Chakar. 2 siblings who lived in New York City are among the dead in the Brussels attacks, after Belgian authorities and the Dutch embassy positively identified the remains this morning. 29-year-old Alexander Penchowski and his 26-year-old sister Sasha were Dutch nationals living in the U.S. They were headed home when the Brussels airport was attacked by 2 ISIS-affiliated suicide bombers on Tuesday. Both Mayor Bill de Blasio and Governor Andrew Cuomo extended their sympathies to the family. Today is the last day to register in person to vote in the presidential primaries on April 19th. New Yorkers who can't make it to a registration center by the time they close at 5 p.m. can also register online or by mail. More than 20,000 first-time voters registered with New York State between March 10th and March 20th in what state officials are calling an unprecedented surge. 85 elected leaders in upstate New York are urging state lawmakers to support Governor Andrew Cuomo's proposal to raise the minimum wage from $9 to $15 by 2021. The governor's plan calls for incremental increases over 3 years in New York City and 6 years elsewhere. Republican lawmakers have suggested to extend the phase-in to 9 years. Lawmakers hope to reach a deal by the budget deadline next Friday, April 21st. Starting Monday, the one train will stop running on weeknights between 96th Street and Dyckman for repairs. Shuttle buses will be available between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. Commuters can also ride the A or C lines, which will operate on normal schedule. This afternoon is looking cloudy and windy, with temperatures nearing the 70s. Henriette Chakar, Columbia Radio News.
New York City Public Advocate Letitia James is suing the city's Department of Education to force it to improve services for the more than 100,000 special needs students in its schools. As Gilda DeCarli reports, one of the key problems is the state's online tracking system.
Megan Moskop is a special ed teacher at MS 324 in Washington Heights. She has a caseload of 17 students, each with an individualized education plan, an IEP. That plan is supposed to spell out exactly how the school is going to meet the students' educational needs. But here's the issue. Too much teaching time is spent on record keeping, and that's where the city's troubled special ed data program comes in. It's called CSIS.
CSIS! Every time I hear that word, I just get palpitations and shivers down my spine.
That's how many special ed teachers feel, according to Moskop. And here's why. It just doesn't work.
I clicked on the service. Error. I clicked on the subject. Error. I clicked on the frequency of service. Error. I clicked on the location. Error. I clicked save and continue. And another error.
If you've ever wanted to toss your computer out the window because nothing seemed to work, well, that's CSIS for you. It's not supposed to be that way, though. CSIS was designed to track the progress of students with special needs, progress that the DOE is required by law to monitor. It's failing, which is why public advocate Letitia James has sued the city. The goal of the suit is to compel the DOE to disclose how it intends to fix the problem. And
the failure of the system has been one of the department's worst kept secrets.
Teachers say the educations of tens of thousands of New York City public school kids are being shortchanged. Special education technology is Jonathan Isaac's domain. He founded a data program called Wonder, which has had a lot of success being implemented in school districts in Texas. Isaac is now hoping to expand Wonder from his new office in Newark. As he looks across the river at New York, he says there's just no excuse.
New York City is certainly a very large and complicated school system, but what you'll find is that the challenges that they're facing in regards to IP, data tracking, and data systems are not necessarily unique to New York.
And what's worse, the city may actually be losing money it could have gotten from the federal government through its Medicaid reimbursements program, the healthcare program that pays the state back for services it provides to the disabled. The city's independent budget office released a report on the CSIS problem 2 weeks ago. The report's author, Yolanda Smith, says the issue is simple.
If you can't track and monitor what children are getting services and what types of services they're getting, you also can't go back and say, hey, we'd like to be reimbursed for paying for those services, because we're really talking about millions of dollars that have to come from somewhere.
Millions of dollars that have to come out of the city's own pocket. So I asked Yolanda Smith, do we need to replace CSIS?
You know, on the one hand, we've really put in a lot of money for CSIS. It's been at least $130 million. So that's a lot of money to just walk away from. The question might be how much more money should we put in to make it work?
And that's precisely the question that public advocate Letitia James's lawsuit hopes to answer. Her office declined to comment, but oral arguments are scheduled to begin sometime next month. Jill DeCarli, Columbia Radio News.
Several hours from now, the Rolling Stones will take the stage in Havana, Cuba. It will be the biggest rock show the country's seen since communists took over in 1959. More than 500,000 people are expected to attend, and it'll be projected on 10 jumbo screens. All a big deal in a country that once banned rock and roll. The concert marks the end of a historic week for U.S.-Cuba relations. Tim Paget covers Latin America for WLRN, a public radio station in Miami. He just got back from Cuba, and I asked him what he saw.
Saw many tourists. Since President Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro normalized relations about 15 months ago, we've seen a huge influx of especially U.S. tourists. Their curiosity about the island has been really piqued, and you saw quite a few of them around Havana checking out all of the gorgeous colonial architecture and all of the, of course, the old vintage 1950s cars that so many Cubans drive around. I think they've got this real curiosity about the place. Sometimes it's a little misplaced. I think there's a little bit too much of a feel of people coming to see this sort of communist theme park. This idea that they want to see Cuba before it changes, which is kind of insulting to a lot of Cuban exiles, because it sort of ignores a lot of the lack of human rights and economic deprivation that so many Cubans experience. But the bottom line is interest in Cuba is at an all-time high.
Yeah, I noticed you talked about sort of like people going because the allure of it being in the 1950s. As far as the tourism businesses such as Airbnb going over there right now, do you think that will change the allure?
Oh, I think so. I mean, there's such a shortage of hotel space in Cuba that the only way the island's really going to be able to accommodate this wave of tourism is through things like people renting out private homes. For example, when I stayed in Havana this past week, I stayed at what's called a casa particular, a private home rented out to foreigners. I think my colleague who rented it did use Airbnb, for example, and we had a very good experience. So yeah, I think that sort of thing has been pivotal in terms of accommodating this influx of tourists. But you're also seeing a big effort to increase the hotel accommodation space. While we were there, for example, Starwood, being a big U.S. hotel conglomerate, they signed a big deal with the Cuban government to manage, I think, at least 3 hotels. So you are seeing a big push to build more hotel infrastructure as well.
We know that the Rolling Stones are going to be playing tonight, and I know this is a really big deal because they were banned over 50 years ago. What do you think this means, or this concert means, for the Cuban people?
Well, it's strange. I think having the Rolling Stones come in and give a free concert in Havana is an attempt, I guess, on the Cuban government's part to connect more with millennial Cubans. There's a huge gap, cultural, generational, etc., political and economic, between the Cuban government, which tends to be older, revolutionary veterans, and younger Cubans. And as a result, I think the Cuban government is trying to find ways to bridge that gap. But what was sort of interesting is, every Cuban millennial I would talk to looked at me as if, well, we like the Rolling Stones music, but Pitbull would have been a lot better. I think they look at the Rolling Stones as sort of a 60s phenomenon, not so much a phenomenon of the 21st century. So I think that, because it's free, you're definitely going to see, an overflow crowd. But I don't know if the Rolling Stones are really a group that strikes a chord with the younger Cubans that are really going to be the future of the country.
All right, Tim. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Tim Padgett of WLRN News. Padgett has covered Latin America and the Caribbean for more than 25 years.
The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey announced yesterday it will spend tens of billions of dollars to upgrade LaGuardia and Newark airports. It also committed to upgrading the city's main bus terminal at Port Authority, even before it knows how much it will cost. Katie Ferguson has more.
Director Patrick J. Foy described yesterday's vote. More money was committed to capital projects in a single day than ever before, including a new Port Authority bus terminal in Midtown Manhattan. But this morning at the current terminal, many passengers hadn't yet heard the news.
No, I didn't see that. I didn't hear about that.
Becky Oakes, off to visit her parents in Ithaca, said that the decision to build a new bus terminal made sense to her.
It's definitely aging. It sometimes seems like it was built by Franz Kafka. Weird things happen here.
But some of her fellow travelers weren't as sure. John Lee was heading to New Paltz, and he said,
I guess it could use some improvement, but I would say it's functional.
And for Whitney Smith, on her way to Buffalo, the change seemed totally unnecessary.
I think this one's fine.
That's like building another Grand Central Station. Like, why? Why would you?
Why would you? Because according to experts, it's falling apart.
It has to happen. The current bus terminal is just, years and years, past its useful life.
That's Adam Foreman. He works at the Center for an Urban Future, a think tank that published a report on New York City's failing infrastructure in 2014. And he says that even if some have gotten used to the norm,
people don't usually know what's kind of underneath the hood.
Foreman says there are problems with heating and cooling systems, inefficiencies that lead to buses idling around. And on top of that,
it's too small, it's poorly designed, it's falling apart. The status quo can't hold. Just the infrastructure itself is something we can't count on for much longer.
But the announcement from the Port Authority board yesterday was short on some important details, like a time frame or budget.
The bus terminal was approved without kind of a sense of how much it would cost. There was kind of somewhat of a rush to approve the funding proposal.
And Foreman attributes that speed to the often fraught working relationship within the Port Authority itself.
There's a bit of a dispute between the New Jersey and New York side about the kind of construction of the new bus terminal. I think this was kind of this compromise.
And it's a deal without a plan for funding right now. Foreman notes that the Port Authority budget is tight, but says that the money isn't always spent efficiently. The recently opened World Trade Center PATH station ended up costing $4 billion, enough to build a subway line, not just one station. But
in terms of just the project selection, LaGuardia Airport, the bus terminal, the new tunnel underneath the Hudson River, these are absolutely critical projects. I don't think anyone would question that they're necessary.
Well, at least not until they see the price tag. Katie Ferguson, Columbia Radio News.
A new scientific technique called CRISPR could allow scientists to correct disease-causing genetic mutations. It acts like a cut-and-paste tool for DNA. 2 labs, one at Harvard, MIT, and one at Berkeley, are tied up in a war over the patent.
In the meantime, some people in the do-it-yourself scientific community are experimenting with the technology. As Osa Seker reports, that's raising concerns about putting powerful scientific tools in the hands of lay people.
Imagine if you could eradicate disease and create a race of healthier humans, all by editing genes. That's still far in the scientific future, but next month at GenSpace, a nonprofit science lab in Brooklyn, students will begin learning how to modify the genome of yeast.
As we go through the workshop, you'll see that there are many different uses for CRISPR.
Ellen Jorgensen is GenSpace's director. This month, she's teaching the lab's first CRISPR workshops.
Some of them are quite profound and kind of jack up our potential as humans to affect the world around us.
That sounds great, right? Science enthusiasts trying out new groundbreaking techniques. But not everyone's thrilled.
It's great to have people saying, hey, I don't need a big lab and a big grant and 52 mentors. I can study something or try something on my own.
Arthur Kaplan is professor in bioethics at NYU. He says giving amateurs access to CRISPR could have downsides. The material scientists want to experiment with, like bacteria, is microscopic.
Well, it may seem innocuous to say, well, we're just going to experiment with bacteria. Look, there are bacteria that make up about probably 60% of what's in our gut. If you got one in there that didn't belong there and it started doing bad things, it could have some pretty lethal consequences.
Scientists are not yet sure how accurate and well-targeted CRISPR is. Kaplan says the technique isn't ready for DIY use.
I'd like to see a little more of that established before the amateurs go to town.
Kaplan says the big concern is CRISPR's incredible potential. If any genome can be edited, that means genes in human embryos can be too. And that's when the slope starts slipping towards eugenics, scientists trying to create superhumans, choosing traits like height or eye color. But Jorgensen says that's not what GenSpace's classes are about.
We have no desire to edit humans and no capability of doing it. And we're not going to get involved in editing the germlines of species.
But Kaplan argues the DIY community's abilities to perform advanced experiments could change quickly. He says there needs to be government regulation of amateurs.
There's no oversight or control of do-it-yourselfers. In this point in a new technology, I think you want to have some eyeballs on what people propose to do.
Josiah Zahner is a genetic engineer and biohacker. He wants more do-it-yourselfers to experiment with science. He thinks that could lead to innovations like new ideas for food resources, renewable fuels, and cheaper medicine.
I think it would be irresponsible of the human race to not allow people to have access to these technologies.
He's even started a crowdfunding campaign.
And kits, so people can perform safe experiments with modern technologies like CRISPR in their home.
So far, the campaign has raised more than 500% of its goal, and the first do-it-yourself CRISPR kits will reach amateur scientists' hands by next month. The kits include petri dishes, DNA, yeast, and more.
The whole point of this Indiegogo campaign is to make science accessible.
Zahner says the benefits of genetic engineering far outweigh the negatives. But Arthur Kaplan, the NYU bioethics professor, says editing any genome from yeast to human risks experiments that could have unknown consequences. The labs at MIT, Harvard, and Berkeley, the ones fighting over who owns the patent, didn't respond to a request for comment. But while their court battle continues, spots are filling up fast at upcoming CRISPR workshops at GenSpace. Åsa Secker, Columbia Radio News.
This week, the musician and Broadway performer Alicia Hall Moran debuted as a one-woman show inspired by a race riot that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 95 years ago. Amina Lovell was in the audience.
Standing in front of a 7-person ensemble at the Schomburg Center, Alicia Hall Moran begins her half-sung, half-narrated stage play entitled Black Wall Street.
Now I'm going to tell you what happened. 95 years ago, one lifetime ago, on May 31st into June 1st in 1921, the Greenwood section, a black section of a segregated Oklahoma town, was destroyed by a mob of angry whites.
Historical records show the riot started when a group of black World War I veterans tried to stop the lynching of a 17-year-old black shoeshiner who'd been accused of trying to rape a white woman. Violence broke out, and members of the Ku Klux Klan stormed the neighborhood.
After 16 hours of gunfire, dragging, burning, and systematic destruction by every manner, including firebombs of nitroglycerin dropped from stolen black-owned airplanes, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was destroyed.
Booker T. Washington had dubbed Greenwood Black Wall Street because it was home to more black millionaires than any other part of the country. The more than 11,000 residents supported thriving black-owned businesses, grocery stores, movie theaters, even 2 independent newspapers, according to historical documents. As Hall Moran sings, the black community had reached the mountaintop.
This is the mountaintop. You build your house there on top of the mountaintop. You build a school there and they burn it down.
And its destruction took away more than just one community's wealth. It sent a message, one that her father felt growing up decades later in segregated Oklahoma City, just an hour and a half away from Tulsa.
These are the facts. As a sophomore, my father integrated his Oklahoma City high school and had the highest GPA in the graduating class. But they couldn't accept a colored valedictorian, so they changed the rules. Only students enrolled since freshman year could compete. His parents...
From Oklahoma to her life in New York, Hall Moran includes a piece about her own brush with New York's Wall Street, from when she was temping trying to support her singing career.
The tube train to Wall Street. People like lava, they flow out of the doors and they flow up the stairs where they fit, they flow, they go out, they get more, they explode into a new day. Tube train to Wall Street.
For Hall Moran, this deeply personal work is a natural next step in her career. A career that's taking her from Bess and Porgy and Bess on Broadway to her residency at the National Sawdust in Brooklyn.
I think it's really honest for me to be making the kind of work I make now that involves how I grew up and what about how I grew up that is interesting to me that I don't hear a lot about.
Reflecting back on race relations in Tulsa, Hall Moran says progression often feels like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It's kind of similar to...
like the way the pot boils, one of the bubbles that was at the top, I'm sure makes its way to the bottom, and it gets to the top, and it gets to the bottom, it gets to the top. But that's how people move forward. the fourth down, sprung up. Can we get a little higher up than we sink down every time?
That's a question Alicia Hall-Moran says she will continue to explore. Her next performances in New York City are in June. Amina Lovell, Columbia Radio News.
Weddings are a time for ceremonies and for parties. They're a time for bringing two families together. When a wedding also means the marriage of two cultures, it's a little trickier, as commentator Nina Agrawal has found out.
It's nearly the end of March. Crunch time. I'm finishing up 2 master's degrees, looking for a job. Oh, and I'm planning a wedding.
Going to the chapel and we're gonna get married.
Not that kind of wedding, more like this. And this. You see, he's Jewish, I'm Indian. Some call couples like us Hindus or Om Shalomers. I'm not kidding. Planning a big wedding, and it will be big, is a major task under any circumstances. But planning a big Indian and big Jewish wedding, I'm in over my head. So many questions. Red sari or white dress? Rabbi or pundit? Shoes or no shoes? It's complicated, this business of interfaith weddings. And it's made me think a lot about being an interfaith couple. Josh and I have been together for more than 6 years. Before we met, he'd been to India. He knew how to introduce himself in Hindi and ask, "Aap kaise hain? How are you?" I grew up going to Shabbat dinners at friends' houses and knew enough Hebrew to say, "Ani lo medaberet Ibrit." I don't speak Hebrew. As a couple, we've approached our differences with curiosity and respect. I've taught him to make chai and chana masala. He's taught me to love seltzer and high-stakes dreidel. On Diwali, the Hindu New Year, we light candles and play 3-card poker. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, we dip apples in honey and wish each other Lishana Tova. Sometimes, though, we bump up against the differences. Josh grew up in a conservative Jewish household. Religion is a big part of his identity. I grew up in a traditional Indian household, and formal religion was less important than cultural traditions. When it came time to fast for Yom Kippur or attend services at synagogue, I was at a loss. Not only because I'm not Jewish, but because the whole concept of religion feels foreign. So we've talked, a lot. And over time, we've chosen the rituals and customs that mean the most to us. Now, when we invite friends over for Shabbat dinners, we light candles and we serve Indian food. After years of making these adjustments one by one, now, with the wedding, we have to figure out a whole bunch all at once. It's an adjustment for our families as well. When my parents got married in India, they barely knew each other. It was arranged based on things like caste, family background, and education. And Josh's parents, they met in a bar in Manhattan. Their families were from the same shtetl outside Warsaw, and I'm sure they hoped their son would marry a Jewish woman. And yet, both sides have welcomed the other and shown only eagerness about our wedding in all its interfaith glory, from trying to negotiate bigger shares of the guest list to throwing a combined Shabbat dinner and Sangeet, a traditional Indian pre-wedding dance party. That's freed us up to focus on the ceremony. As we stand under our wedding canopy, which Jews call a chuppah and Hindus a mandap, we'll exchange garlands as well as rings. We'll circle a fire 7 times and invite relatives to recite the 7 blessings. And when it's finished, we'll all dance. That part doesn't need any explaining.
Nina Agrawal is getting married in August. They will serve paneer as well as shmear.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Shandukani Muraudzi.
And I'm Jeffy Bernard.
A new Marvel Comics TV show is due out next month. It features a martial arts fighter who is not Asian, but some comic enthusiasts think he should be.
Today is the 105th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that cost 146 lives. Activists say there's still lots of work to be done for workers' rights.
These stories and more coming up, but first, these headlines.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Isabella Kulkarni. Defense Secretary Ash Carter announced this morning that Haji Iman, the finance minister of ISIL, has been killed. Iman went by a number of aliases, including Abdul Rahman, Mustafa Muhammad, and Abdu Allah Al-Afari. The exact cause of death wasn't announced. However, Iman is the second leader of ISIL killed by the United States this month, says Defense Secretary Carter.
The second senior ISIL leader we've successfully targeted this month, after confirming the death of ISIL's so-called Minister of War a short time ago.
This represents a broader effort by the U.S. of eliminating key members of ISIL. Laura Gamba reports.
The Pentagon announced that it would likely increase the number of American forces in Iraq. General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the decision hadn't been made, but it is going to be discussed with the president soon. Defense Department officials said more forces are needed to take back ISIL-controlled territory.
President Obama returned to the White House today after this week's historic trip to Cuba and Argentina, a trip whose purpose was to reconstruct diplomatic relationships between the U.S. and Latin America. It's been almost a century since the last sitting president visited Cuba, and Obama's trip to Argentina coincided with the 40th anniversary of the coup that installed a military regime responsible for the country's dirty war, a period of brutal violence from the late 70s to early 80s. At a memorial for the victims, Obama paid tribute to the nation's history.
We have a responsibility each and every day to make sure that wherever we see injustice, wherever we see rule of law flouted, that we are honest witnesses, that we're speaking out and that we're examining our own hearts and taking responsibility to make this a better place.
The United States government backed the military regime responsible for the death and disappearance of tens of thousands of Argentinians. Belgian officials have identified the third suicide bomber in Tuesday's deadly attack in Brussels. Najim Lakraoui, a citizen of Belgium, blew himself up in one of the two bombings in the Belgian capital. Authorities say Lakraoui also engineered the suicide vests used in the deadly attacks in Paris in November. He is suspected of being one of the only surviving participants in those attacks. A new issue of the tabloid magazine The National Enquirer accused presidential candidate Ted Cruz of extramarital affairs. Cruz rebuffed the accusations, saying,
"Let me be clear, this National Enquirer story is garbage. It is complete and utter lies, and it is a smear that has come from Donald Trump and his henchmen."
The controversy comes after a week of bitter back and forth between Trump and Cruz. Next up for both campaigns is the Wisconsin primary on April 5th. Isabella Kulkarni, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I am Shandukani Muraudzi.
And I'm Jeffy Bernard. NYU announced yesterday it's raising the minimum wage for campus workers to $15 an hour. That brings it in line with Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo's efforts to raise the minimum wage for state and city workers. Oliver Arnoldi headed downtown to ask NYU students what they think about the raise.
A stone's throw from the NYU campus in the Village, I sit down for coffee with Katie Shane of the NYU Labour Movement, and she is all smiles. Why are you so happy this morning?
We won 15 yesterday. You know, to be the first private university in the country to do this is a huge deal.
15 is the campaign led by Shane's group to raise the minimum wage of NYU undergraduate student workers from $9 to $15 over the next 3 years. Next year, the minimum will be $12. NYU confirmed the raise last night, and it's a decision that's making plenty of students happy.
I think it's beautiful. I love it. It's a good idea.
I'll be happy to get $3 more an hour than I used to, so I'm not complaining at all.
That's freshman Kaylin Hayes and junior Al Gilardi, who work together on the circulation desk in the basement of NYU's Bopst Library. But upstairs, not everyone's completely satisfied, like Ravina Vakil.
It's like, oh, we're getting a wage increase. It's going to be awesome, but it's going to take 3 years for it to get to the $15. So I just think it could be done a little faster.
What are you going to do with the extra $3?
Well, $3, you can't really do much with that. You know, you can get maybe a coffee.
Vakil has a point. An undergraduate degree at NYU costs around $75,000 a year. That, on top of living in one of the country's most expensive cities, means that it could still be hard for NYU students to get by.
Can still be quite challenging to find affordable units, even at $15 an hour.
Alan Lightfelt is a data scientist at StreetEasy, a New York real estate agency. When it comes to housing, NYU students have to make a choice. They either take in more roommates or move to the outer boroughs. But like for many New Yorkers,
These are trade-offs that the lowest paid have to make every day.
The NYU raise comes in the middle of a bigger push by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to raise the state minimum wage to $15. But back at NYU, Shane sees the struggle of her university and that of other activists across the city and state as sharing common missions.
Our campaign wouldn't have worked if we hadn't had the support of workers in the community. And so we're going to support them till they get what they need as well.
For the time being, NYU student workers can anticipate enjoying a little more money and an extra cup of coffee. Oliver Arnoldi, Columbia Radio News.
Earlier this month, the Secretary of Homeland Security announced that the federal government would step up deportations of children who are in the U.S. illegally. Henriette Shakar found that this is adding pressure to non-profit groups that are already struggling to provide children with adequate legal services.
On the 12th floor of the New York City Immigration Court lies the Pro Bono Room. There, you can find colored pencils, stickers, and books in English and Spanish about frogs, sharks, and visiting the zoo. In most cases, it is also where unaccompanied children find an attorney to represent them in court for the first time. So how does the conversation between them begin?
I always like to ask what your favorite soccer team is. It's much easier to ask, do you like Barcelona or do you like Real Madrid?
That's Guy Stamper, the Director of Legal Services at the Safe Passage Project, one of the organizations that make up iCare. And after he breaks the ice, Stamper tries to understand what life was like for the child in their home country and why they came to the United States. He uses that information to match the child with an attorney and build a legal defense. What organizations like Safe Passage also do is give Know Your Rights presentations to help children better understand how the U.S. immigration system works. Allison Wilkinson, staff attorney at The Door, another iCare partner, says,
Immigration court, it's not the court you see on Law & Order. It's a room with a judge's bench and 2 tables before it and then benches behind, kind of a gate. However, it is a courtroom with all the process of a courtroom, and it is very intimidating for any adult, and especially any child, to have to go sit before a judge.
Although iCare is funded by the New York City Council, it also takes cases of children who come to court from as far north as Albany and as far east as Nassau. Statistics collected by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection show that since last year, the number of unaccompanied children detained at the southwest border has nearly doubled. Many of them end up in New York, but because other regions around the state don't have sufficient legal aid programs, the number of children in need of representation is much larger than the number of attorneys available to help them. This means that children either have to find an attorney on their own or represent themselves. That not only compromises their right to due process, as Wilkinson from The Door argues.
A 7-year-old's not going to be able to sit down and say, well, Your Honor, today I'm pursuing asylum and I'd like to plead to the NTA and I admit allegations 1 through 4, but I have a problem with the charge that was applied and I will be filing my application for asylum with the asylum office. That's never, ever going to happen.
But on an emotional level, the imbalance of power can be hard to take.
The fact that when they sit in the chair at immigration court, unrepresented, their feet don't touch the ground, that's something that sticks with you.
Stamper from Safe Passage also says that most iCare organizations are already at capacity.
That's, an understatement. To say that we're overworked is probably more accurate.
At Safe Passage alone, there are 10 full-time attorneys working on over 500 cases. The system is buckling under the pressure, even in well-prepared New York City. With violence worsening in Central America and the number of child migrants on the rise, the caseload is only expected to grow heavier. Henriette Shakar, Columbia Radio News.
Today is the last day New Yorkers can register to vote in the presidential primaries, and they're doing so in droves.
The state's online voter registration system has experienced a surge in applications, more than 40,000 people in just 10 days. Half of those were first-time voters. As Allison Vickerbeck reports, Donald Trump's controversial candidacy is pushing more minority and female voters to sign up.
According to the Pew Center, Republican turnout early in the primaries was at its strongest in decades, and Democratic turnout was almost as high as the last election, the highest in nearly 25 years. One of the factors motivating people to vote? Donald Trump.
A person who is very flat-chested is very hard to be a 10.
That was a clip from an ad from the Our Principles PAC, part of a campaign trying to motivate voters to turn against Trump on Election Day. It features quotes about women from Donald Trump.
I'd look her right in that fat, ugly face of hers.
Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that?
This is how Donald Trump talks about our mothers, our sisters,
our daughters.
If you believe America deserves better, vote against Donald Trump. Mark Favors is the co-chair of the New York Democratic Lawyers Council's Minority Voters Committee. He says regardless of whether people are for or against him, Trump's candidacy is motivating minorities.
For the black community, I know that he definitely has energized voters, and he will energize voters in the fall. And, of course, the Latino community as well.
Favors and many other organizations like his are trying to get more minorities to vote.
We're doing a lot of voter registration. There's a lot of push to register people of color.
And he's willing to use unconventional methods to get that vote out.
Kanye West had a little pop-up in Soho. When new sneakers would come out and when people would be in line all night, I would go register those people to vote. But then, registration is one part. You still have to go vote.
Spencer Kimball is a professor at Emerson College and the advisor to its polling society. He says although minorities represent an important group of eligible voters, they tend not to turn out to vote as much as whites. In the last presidential election, only a little over half of New York State's Hispanics voted. Kimball says they're 15% less likely to vote than the white population.
They're also much more likely not to be registered. If they were able to move up and get well organized, they would become quite influential in this election cycle.
Kimball says minorities make up a big part of New York State's population. A surge in minority voting could make a big difference to Republicans and Democrats alike.
Hispanics make up about 20% of the state, and African Americans make up about 14%.
According to the Emerson College Polling Society, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are expected to lead in their respective New York primaries. Unlike Trump, Clinton's lead has been helped by the support of African Americans and Hispanics. But a strong showing from minority voters is what all candidates are hoping for, including Donald Trump, who's making big campaign promises.
I will get more Latinos than anybody else. And I'll tell you what, I will take them away from Hillary Clinton.
New Yorkers have until end of day today to register if they want to vote in the primaries coming up April 19th. Allison Vickerbeck, Columbia Radio News.
Comic books have taken over the entertainment world. It started with blockbuster hits like Iron Man and Captain America. Then Netflix teamed up with Marvel to create Jessica Jones and Daredevil. New shows are being added to this world, but as Susie Shear reports, it's not getting more diverse.
The action-packed world of Marvel can now be found on Netflix. Viewers can watch their favorite superheroes fight their way through each episode, like this one.
Not everyone deserves a happy ending.
That cheerful guy is Daredevil, and he's about to be joined by another superhero next year. This week, Marvel announced its leading man for the forthcoming series Iron Fist, actor Finn Jones. He's 28, plays Loras Tyrell from HBO's Game of Thrones, and he's white.
When they actually cast or announced the casting of Finn Jones, it was disappointment, of course, but it wasn't a surprise.
That's Keith Chow. He's the founder of the pop culture blog Nerds of Color. And he thought the show's main character, known as Danny Rand when he isn't the superhero Iron Fist, should have been played by an Asian American actor. That's because Danny Rand is a martial artist, and he learns the craft in the mystical Asian land of Kunlun. Chow says by casting a white guy, Marvel is falling into the trap of cultural appropriation.
There's this long history of taking what's foreign and exotic and then putting it through the lens of white people.
To be fair, Iron Fist is white in the comics. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed Danny Rand takes everything he learned in Kunlun and goes back to Harlem to fight the bad guys. But Chow says it's an overused storyline that can be boiled down to this.
White guy goes to Asia,
learns their secrets, comes back a superhero.
But he says it doesn't have to be that way. By casting an Asian American actor, Iron Fist would be about cultural reconnection, not appropriation. That's something he, as a second-generation Asian American, could relate to.
The idea of a Danny Rand going back to Kunlun and kind of rediscovering and reconnecting to that culture and his heritage, I thought would be a more interesting story than just another white guy who goes to the Mystic Orient and comes back better for it.
Cultural appropriation isn't rare in comic books. Another Marvel character, Luke Cage, has also been controversial. Luke Cage is a black man with superhuman strength who teams up with Iron Fist. 31-year-old Andre Ford, who works at Midtown Comics near Times Square, is also black. As we stand among shelves of comic books, he says the problem with the Luke Cage series was blaxploitation, or the perpetuation of stereotypes of black people.
A lot of the writers at the time in the 70s, they were white people writing for black people. So there was a lot of lines like, hey man, you jive turkey, you can't be digging this, that kind of stuff.
Ford says he doesn't see an issue with Danny Rand being played by a white man, but he would think differently if Marvel cast a white man as an Asian superhero, such as Marvel's Master of Kung Fu.
If they cast like a white dude to play that, that's messed up.
But this happens all the time in Hollywood. Think Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's, or Jim Sturgis in 21, or, most recently, Emma Stone in Aloha. They're all white actors playing Asian characters. That's called whitewashing. Filmmaker Jim Adachi says this happens because there aren't enough Asian Americans represented in the media. A report by the University of South California says at least half of all movies or TV shows last year failed to include a speaking character of Asian descent. But Adachi says it's not only about who's on the screen. Who's behind it is just as important. He says change won't happen
until we have the scripts to support it, until we have the roles, that has to be funded by someone.
But Vincent Pham, a media studies professor at California State University, says it's a tough battle in an industry where whiteness is the standard.
The default tends to be whiteness. And then if you're making it non-white, then you have to make an argument about why it should not be white.
And that's a fight even Iron Fist may not be able to win. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Susie Xie.
Coming up, the International Auto Show opens today, and the SUV is making a comeback. But first, hundreds gathered this week in Lower Manhattan to pay tribute to the 146 workers who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The fire, which took place 105 years ago today, was the worst industrial disaster in the history of the city.
Today, 90 teams of artists are drawing chalk figures on sidewalks with details of each worker who died. As Elizabeth Brockway reports, people at both events say the effects of that fire are still being felt today.
It was a Saturday afternoon, just before closing time, on March 25, 1911. It was most likely a cigarette ash falling into a bin of scrap cloth that started the flames that killed over 100 workers. Today, Ruth Circle is decorating sidewalks in front of the homes of those who died that day.
Right now we're at 19 Clinton Street, just below Houston, and we're chalking Becky Neubauer, who was 19 years old and lived within walking distance of the factory.
Like Neubauer, many workers were women in their teens and 20s. The youngest was just 14. Circle started chalk over a decade ago as a memorial.
I think the idea behind it was partly frustration with the idea that we always say never again or we will never forget. But of course, we always do forget, and these things happen again and again.
Marianne Traciati is the president of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition. The group organizes an official commemoration each year in honor of those who died in the fire. She says the factory owners were focused on profit, not safety.
The building was fireproof, but everything inside, of course, was not. Workers on the 9th floor were trapped, and 146 people died. 62 of them jumped from the 9th floor to their death on the sidewalk below.
Approximately 150 workers survived. The tragedy helped prompt significant progress for national workers' rights and safety regulations.
This is something that could have been avoided had worker protections been in place. We know that the doors were locked in the factory to prevent union organizers from coming in and to prevent theft, and workers were trapped inside the building.
Kara Knoll is with the New York City chapter of the AFL-CIO. It represents over 1 million workers and 300 unions in the city.
We're here just saying we remember, and we are recommitting to making sure that workers have what they need in New York City and around the world.
Knoll says its goal is to ensure that work sites have proper regulations in place, ones that would have helped prevent the Triangle Fire. Unfortunately, many of these safety protocols were only installed because of Triangle. But while there has been significant improvement since the fire, Knoll said workers are still fighting.
They're better off now than they were 105 years ago, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
In 2013, the AFL-CIO reported that just over 4,500 workers were killed on the job in the United States, and more than 50,000 died from occupational diseases. Today, Ruth Circle has teams all across the city, from Harlem to the Lower East Side to Brownsville and even one in Hoboken. Their goal is to make sure that all 146 people who died at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire are remembered. Elizabeth Brockway, Columbia Radio News.
North Carolina is making headlines this week for passing a new law that rolls back anti-discrimination protections for the LGBT community. Equality North Carolina is an organization dedicated to securing rights for LGBT individuals. I asked Executive Director Chris Scrow what led up to the vote. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. In a nutshell, what led up to the special meeting of North Carolina's General Assembly on Wednesday afternoon?
The city of Charlotte, which is the largest city in North Carolina, in February passed an ordinance by an overwhelming majority of their city council, which would add non-discrimination protections for gay and transgender Charlotteans in areas like public accommodations and vehicles for hire. Charlotte's ordinance mirrors ordinances that already exist in 200 other cities across the country, like New York, but also like Myrtle Beach and Columbia, South Carolina. And so it's a best practice, not unusual at all, ordinance that major cities and minor cities across the country have. The General Assembly raced back in, called this $42,000 a day special session, and they claimed that it was because they were concerned about the public safety risk.
Right. So why did people think that this was a public safety issue?
Unfortunately, there is a terrible amount of misinformation around LGBT issues. In the wake of the Houston campaign to defend their human rights ordinance there, our opposition ran millions and millions of dollars worth of television commercials that showed scary-looking men entering women's restrooms. And so that's a lie. It's already illegal, obviously, to be a sexual predator in a restroom or anywhere else. Laws like this don't allow men into women's restrooms. They do protect transgender men using the men's room and transgender women using the women's room. But our opposition has really not limited themselves in their willingness to just completely lie to people in Houston and now in North Carolina.
Now, people are referring to this as the most anti-gay bill in the country. Can you tell us why or some of the reasons that people would call it that?
Yes, it goes a step further than bills like the so-called religious exemption or religious freedom bills that we see that have some sort of balancing test and say that the discrimination at least has to be because of a sincerely held religious belief. This goes a step further and says there is no test, there's no requirement. Everybody and anybody can discriminate and should discriminate against members of the gay and transgender community. And this impacted employment protections. It impacted public accommodations protections. It impacted cities, towns, and our public school systems here in North Carolina.
Now, one of the consequences that the state may face now is that large companies will pull out of doing business in the state. Do you think that this will force the governor to reconsider his decision?
Yes, I do. We have seen the NBA threaten to remove its All-Star game from Charlotte. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Red Hat, Biogen, IBM, Marriott. The list literally is so long at this point of companies who have said that they are uncomfortable with the law. The governor's hands, he has tied them himself to come back and deal with this. And we're going to be calling on them today to, as their first act of business, reconsider, repeal this legislation, replace it with comprehensive non-discrimination protections that include sexual orientation and gender identity.
That was Executive Director of Equality North Carolina, Chris Groh. Chris, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Here in New York, commentator Daniel Rostis argues that despite having legalized same-sex marriage last year, the country has a long way to go in terms of accepting its non-straight citizens.
Everybody wants gay friends. Not everyone wants gay kids. That's a line from Straight, a show about a man struggling with his sexuality that I saw on Tuesday night. And it makes a good point. Just because same-sex marriage is now finally legal in all 50 states does not mean everything is suddenly okay for queer people in North America. Our society is built on thousands of years of assuming that heterosexuality is the default. It can be hard to wrap your head around the ways it shuts people out if they don't meet that standard. Growing up gay in North America isn't glamorous. It's not fashionable. It may not be as dangerous as it is in lots of other places in the world, but at a very young age, you get the sense that you're different. You get the sense that there's lots of people out there who hate you for that. And that's before you live through decades of homophobic slurs and hostility and, in far too many cases, violence. A Supreme Court judgment forcing states to let us get married doesn't take that lived experience away. I know it's too ingrained in me, and several of my gay friends, for it to ever go away. It definitely won't heal the scars of older generations of gay men in this country who had it much worse than I ever did. Think about this, and don't worry, you don't have to tell anyone, but do you still take some kind of special notice when you see a same-sex couple being affectionate in public? I know I do. I know the first time I held hands with a boy in public, walking by the lake in a small town in Ontario, people stared. They didn't attack us, they didn't say anything, but they certainly noticed us. Last week I saw a gay couple cuddling on a megabus and I almost wanted to congratulate them. Someday, I really hope, we won't notice these insignificant things, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. In 2016 in America, I still have to read news about a gay couple that had boiling water poured on them by one of their stepfathers as they slept. This happened in February, in Georgia. I still have to read about North Carolina forbidding cities from passing local anti-discrimination laws because the city of Charlotte tried to protect its LGBT residents. Gay men still can't give blood unless they've been abstinent for a year, even though all blood is tested for HIV and other diseases. So why the limitation on gay men? Are we unclean? Are we not trustworthy? What is it exactly? So the next time you're feeling super progressive for watching Drag Race or Ellen, ask yourself what the people you're watching had to endure to get where they are today. Ask yourself, if one of your siblings brought a same-sex partner to a family wedding, how would that go over? How would you feel if one of your parents sat you down and told you they were homosexual? I don't have the answers, but I think it's worth remembering that when it comes to how we treat non-straight people in America in 2016, we haven't figured everything out just yet.
Daniel Rostis thinks it's so nice of you to offer to set him up with someone. Is it the only other gay person you know? Yeah, that's what he thought.
Thousands of people will stream into the Javits Center this week for the New York International Auto Show, which begins today. It's the oldest and largest show of its kind in the country. And as Adrian Mall explains, one kind of vehicle in particular is dominating the show this year.
Even before the doors open at 10, the line outside the Javits Center was hundreds long. Kirk McDonald managed to snag a spot near the front of the line.
I am a huge auto show fan. I've been coming to the auto show since it was at the Coliseum since I was a little kid, about 8 years old.
So how many years has that been?
I am 54 now, so It's been a long time, yeah.
Inside, among the rows and rows of gleaming cars, there seem to be two types of people, buyers and dreamers. Michael Barnett is definitely a buyer.
I own 4 cars, man, so I'm maybe not your normal profile of buyer.
He's an insurance consultant from Indianapolis who's in town on business.
I own a Mercedes, an Audi, a Lexus. I'm probably going to buy that damn thing.
and he's got his eye on a $72,000 Maserati SUV called the Levante.
It's got a Ferrari engine in it. The white one's got a leather interior with a Zegna silk inserts.
I don't even know what that is.
Zegna's a custom clothing manufacturer.
Then there are the dreamers. Over in the Cadillac section of the show floor, Jose Alicia is staring glassy-eyed at a Cadillac Escalade.
Quite honestly, I saw this 2 years ago. I got a picture of him on my old phone. I just fell in love with him. I just love him. Period. Just love him.
How much does he love it?
On a scale of 1 to 10, this gets a 99. That's how much I love this caddy.
Alicia says he plans on buying it someday, but his girlfriend, Christine Cruz, says that day probably won't come anytime soon.
A lot of these stuff, we probably won't be able to afford, but it's kind of nice just coming here and just seeing what it is, what's out there.
Still, the thing Barnett and Alicia both have in common is that they're both looking at SUVs. After several years of declining sales, SUVs are back. Michelle Krebs is an industry analyst for Autotrader.com, and she says,
sport utility vehicles are hot not only in the U.S., but in China, in Western Europe, all over the world.
She says low interest rates for car loans and cheap gas have been propelling demand, but so has a worldwide shift in taste for bigger cars.
We do not see an end to this trend. We see sport utilities continuing to increase in sales of all sorts, from small to large to cheap to very expensive. And that is not just a national trend, that's a global trend.
And Krebs says SUVs aren't the gas guzzlers they used to be.
Auto industry has made huge progress in engineering smaller engines, but that have a lot, still more power, but get better fuel economy.
Not that that's a big concern for Barnett, who was looking at the Maserati. Are you concerned about, the gas? I mean...
No.
Why not?
Because I'm not.
So for buyers like Barnett, the only question of when he gets the car will be how quickly he can get it out of his wallet. But for dreamers like Alicia, who has his heart set on the Cadillac, he might have to find another way.
This car right here, if it was in candy apple red, I guarantee I'll have to drag it out of this showroom because I want it. I love it.
He wants to steal some cars already.
Adrian Ma, Columbia Radio News.
If you've got a hoverboard, the list of places where you can ride it is getting shorter. The Path, MTA, and more than 30 universities have recently announced a ban on the boards. As Isabella Kulkarni reports, the motorized scooters have been both under fire and on fire lately.
Hoverboards are illegal in New York City, so gliding on the sidewalk or street could get you a $200 fine. The devices don't actually hover. They're more like a slimmed-down Segway without the pole. Len Dolan is the head of fire safety at Kane University in New Jersey. He says he banned hoverboards from campus because they're a fire hazard.
We have several thousand students in our dorms, and it was my opinion that we shouldn't be waiting for a fire to occur.
The U.S. Consumer Protection Product Safety Commission says since December, it's received more than 60 reports of flaming boards, destroying at least 2 homes. A quick YouTube search for hoverboard fires, and you'll get pages of this.
There we go. It happened.
That's a video of a hoverboard catching on fire, uploaded in December from Delvon Simmons. And it's not just fires that have people concerned.
New trick.
Emily Furman is sitting next to her physical therapist, Susan Skanga. She's slowly turning her palm upwards towards the ceiling.
Oh, look at that.
Am I past 45?
Yes, you're at 40. You're almost at 50.
Skanga is measuring Furman's wrist mobility. It's been limited since she fell off a hoverboard at a Hanukkah party.
You can see the scars here. The surgeon made an incision on my hand and then on my forearm.
The scars are big, about half the length of a finger. They're purple and dimpled. Furman's fall was so bad, she had a huge metal rod sticking out of her arm for about 2 months to hold her fragmented bones together. She shows me a picture.
That looks like Edward Scissorhands or something. I know, I had a bionic arm for a while.
Furman's boyfriend, Jamie Propp, says a friend encouraged her to try it out.
It went from being this moment of like, oh, wow, look, Emily's doing the hoverboard and she's doing pretty well on it, to
we have to call an ambulance.
She's like seriously injured and we need to get her medical attention immediately.
Furman says she's got pretty good balance. The main problem was getting off the board.
There is a way to dismount the hoverboard, but if it's not intuitive, and that's just step backwards off of it.
The Consumer Product Safety Commission is the organization responsible for making sure products like hoverboards are safe. Patty Davis is a spokesperson there.
We have seen hundreds of emergency room treated injuries associated with hoverboard falls.
The commission is investigating dozens of hoverboard companies for safety concerns from fires and falls. They issued an open letter to all manufacturers last month, most of them based in China. And within days, some of the nation's largest retailers like Toys R Us, Amazon, and Walmart stopped selling them. With most hoverboards being manufactured overseas, Davis says,
these hoverboards, if they fail to meet that standard, will be stopped at the ports, detained, or seized.
And in the meantime, the commission is asking hoverboard manufacturers, any of them, to work to meet the Underwriters Laboratories safety standards. That's where Dregenberg comes in.
I'm the Consumer Safety Director for Underwriters Laboratories, UL.
You may know their logo, a little circle with a UL in the center that's on everything from your toaster to your television. They regulate all kinds of electronics by making safety standards for products that are already on store shelves. Dregenberg says the biggest problem is with the lithium-ion batteries inside.
The hoverboard has many more lithium-ion batteries than, say, your laptop or your cell phone has.
A number of people also misuse them by overcharging the batteries, which Dregenberg says could be causing the fires. But despite the government's pressure on manufacturers to make the board safer, places are still selling them. And that surprises Jamie Propp, the boyfriend of Emily Furman, remember, who broke her wrist?
They're extremely dangerous. They're these Trojan horses in a way because they're so appealing. Who wouldn't want to look cool, gliding down the street, listening to music on their headphones, just kind of like chilling, doing 360s.
And doing 360s and doing them safely are two different things. In the meantime, Furman won't be testing her gliding skills anytime soon. Isabella Kulkarni, Columbia Radio News.
Well, that does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Tyler Pratt. Leading our staff of reporters were senior producers Jakai Johnson and Adele Mber.
Director Daniel Rostis coordinated our studio production with Amina Lovell and Susie Shear.
Our web team, Alison Vickerbeck and Stephen Basaha, got this stream live to the web. Laura Gamba produced the news. Senior editor Nina Agarwal and assistant editor Osa Secker led our copy team.
Our instructors, Kerry Donahue, Danielle Alarcon, Sally Herships, and Matt Collette advised our staff. I'm Shandukani Muraudzi.
And I'm Jeffy Bernard. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.